Welcome to the Prospective Doctor podcast, brought to you by Med School Coach. Each week we cover topics related to the pre-med journey to medical school and beyond, from the MCAT to completing your application and from starting medical school to choosing a specialty. Our podcast will provide essential information for anyone contemplating a career in medicine.
Hey everyone, thanks so much for joining me. It's Dr. Marinelli here. I thought today that we should talk about the people that do not have any acceptances at this point in the application cycle. We've talked about this before on the podcast, but I thought that it would be worth reiterating this topic because we get so many questions on this during the year. And I think it's just a really important message to put out there as far as your expectations and what you should be doing. Just to get everybody on the same page out there. Not everybody in the point in the application cycle, and I'm talking the end of the fall into the winter, will have interviews or will have acceptances. We get a very swayed view of acceptances at this point when you look just at resources like Student Doctor or Reddit or things like that, where you just see people posting about all of their interviews and all of their acceptances. And when you start looking at all of those acceptances and interview offers, if you don't have the same amount or if you don't have any, it could definitely be very nerve-wracking. In addition to that, this part of the application cycle is just inherently difficult. And the reason for that is in the late spring and the summer, you are just putting together your application. You're frantically getting your AMCAS in, getting all those letters of recommendation, and finishing up the final touches on your personal statement. And then summer comes along and you're just hurrying to finish all of those secondary applications that have come along. And it's a very, very busy and demanding time. And then all of a sudden, after the secondaries are submitted, it's kind of like radio silence between you and most of the medical schools. A lot of medical schools will send some emails saying we're in receipt of your application and we'll be in touch. A lot of schools are just quiet. And so the applicants just kind of left hanging thinking, well, what's happening with my application? Do I have a chance of getting an acceptance still? So let's kind of break it down on what happens after you submit your secondaries. So after you submit your secondaries, and let's say the earliest that's going to be around the middle towards end of August, schools are now going to sit down and review the thousands of applications that they received. Some schools are receiving 10,000 applications. And from my experience, each of those applications are reviewed. Yes, there is some screening done with GPA and MCAT, and a certain threshold is probably met by most schools. But most schools are actually going to sit down and physically review the application of each of those applicants that they receive. How in-depth they review the application, of course, is going to vary from school to school and the strength of the applicant. But as you can imagine, that takes a lot of time to kind of go through those applications, each one at a time, and rank them and categorize them into their competitiveness and their competition for being a prospective student. So just thinking of it that way, it takes a lot of time for medical schools to get back to people. Obviously, as you've read on different forums, some will get back right away and some will take longer to offer interview invites and then subsequent acceptances. And that's just going to be based on how competitive your application is, when it was received, and how it was reviewed. In regards to interview invites being sent out, there is, again, some of that rhyme and reason of, okay, you were one of the earliest applicants to apply and you're very competitive, so you get one of the earliest invites. However, I find a lot of people that are relatively competitive applicants and they applied relatively early find themselves in this boat where they just do not seem to be getting a ton of interview invites. And at that point, there is a lot of luck to the application process. What I mean by that is at a lot of schools, what happens is each applicant is reviewed by a specific member of the admissions process to determine whether or not that applicant should be offered an interview. So first, they're kind of separated based on metrics. And then, as I said earlier, they're reviewed individually. How that review goes is somewhat subjective to that individual reviewer of the application. So at some schools, they have a designation of a numerical system to apply to the metrics. So let's say they have a scaling system of where your GPA lies on a scale, where your MCAT lies on a scale, how much your research lies on a scale, and that's all given a numerical value and totaled up to a certain sum. And if that sum is over a certain amount, then that person is offered an interview. And if not, they're either rejected or placed on a waiting list. So some schools will have that process, and other schools may or may not have a similar process. However, as you can imagine, that's very, very subjective to the individual reviewer. Not everybody will designate the same numerical value for reviewing things like extracurricular activities and the strength of extracurricular activities, since there is some subjectivity to that. In addition, with schools that don't have that numerical value, individual reviewers have different standards for qualifications. Some reviewers are much more focused on research and how much research a particular applicant has. And some reviewers may focus on other aspects, like how much community service an applicant has. And some reviewers are much more focused on the total numbers of an applicant. So what this means all in all, and to summarize, is basically when a person sits down and looks at your application, their rating and the subsequent move to the next stage of a possible interview is based on their subjective opinion in some way of your application. And that's what I mean when it kind of comes down to luck. There's a lot of luck involved in that process of who is actually reviewing you. And so every applicant tries to put themselves in the best position possible when they're applying, which is the right thing to do. You want to have the highest grades, the highest MCAT possible, the best extracurricular activities. Get your application in early, put together a superb application. However, there is an element of luck on who is actually reviewing that application, and if they find you favorably and you really appeal to them, or maybe you appeal less to them. So that is a tough part of the application process, but it's just kind of an inherent part of it. There's just so many applications. Medical schools have to split it up among various people to review them. It would be impossible for one person in the admissions department to review each applicant at length just because they receive so many applications. Now that we've kind of talked about the process and what you can kind of expect from the process, well, what if you are one of those people that don't have interviews at the end of the fall and early winter or into the early spring? First off, don't worry too much. There is still plenty of time to get an interview invite. Most schools extend interviews all the way until April or sometimes even May, and I've even seen a few straggling interviews into June. So there is still plenty of time for interviews. The interview season is long and a lot of them are offered. So don't worry quite yet. I usually tell people if they're into the mid-spring, February, March, definitely April or May, and they have no interviews, then it's time to really start thinking about an application. But these kind of months were November, December, January, early February, don't worry too much. There's still lots of time. Obviously, if you've applied to 30 schools and 27 of them you received a rejection, well, then it's kind of time to start worrying. But if you applied to 30 schools and you just haven't heard from 25 of them, then you still have a shot. So what can you do during this time? Unfortunately, there's not a ton that you can do during this time, but there are a couple things. So one would be to write a letter of interest or an update letter if you haven't done so already. We have a separate podcast on those, so I won't go into depth on those letters. But basically, if the school accepts them, and you should always look to see if a school will accept additional correspondence after submission of your primary and secondary application. If they do accept additional correspondence, then you can send them a letter where you're summarizing any new activities or updated activities since you submitted your application to kind of support your application and put more emphasis on certain activities, and express your interest in attending that school and having an interview at that school. So maybe picking a couple things that are interesting to you about that school and writing about that and how you would love to have an interview there if offered. The letters should be brief, usually less than a page, and you shouldn't send them too frequently. I wouldn't send letters more than every couple of months. Otherwise, you're just going to inundate the admissions committees and they're not going to want to read all those letters. It's just too much. So you can send those letters of interest or update letters. The other thing you can do is keep working on your extracurricular activities or taking courses. Whatever it is that you have been doing, keep doing it. And I know that kind of sounds basic, but that's important too, because when you do go in for an interview, you want to make sure that you can continue to talk about your activities, give them any updates or any new developments, etc., etc. So keep up with the things that you've already been doing. Obviously, this seems kind of simple, but another thing, you want to just make sure that you're consistently checking your emails and including your spam folder and also your snail mail too. Some things still come through the regular mail, so you should be checking the mail in case you get an interview invite via regular snail mail. In addition, if you have any changes in your email or your phone number, make sure you're updating medical schools on that. The other thing that you should do is think about your application. Think about any weaknesses in your application, and along the lines of continuing your extracurricular activities, if there is a specific weakness in your application, well, now is the time to address it. If you, for instance, didn't have any community service work when you submitted your application, well, maybe you should really start looking for that opportunity now, and you could always write an update letter with that activity to help strengthen your application. And same thing goes with courses or grades or GPA. Maybe your GPA is not that high. This is the time to maybe start thinking and taking some post-bac courses or extension courses so you can boost up that GPA. Again, I don't think you necessarily need to start planning for a full-on reapplication until later. However, it is good to always try to improve those areas of your application if you can. And finally, the last thing to do is just kind of sit tight. Everybody has this difficulty during the application process. People are anxious to hear from schools. They want to know what's going on. It's just an all-in-all anxiety-provoking process, just waiting. But that's part of it, is just waiting and being patient. So enjoy the holiday season. Take some time to relax, have fun with family and friends, go and travel, do things that you enjoy, and try to keep your mind off of it. Keep in touch with schools, but then also have some confidence in your application and just kind of play out the waiting game. Every year I see people that are in this position that don't have interviews and they're frustrated and they're worried and they're always asking what to do. And every year I see lots of those same people that haven't gotten interviews or acceptances in the fall start getting interviews and acceptances into the spring. It happens every single year. I can attest to that personally. When I applied to medical school, I didn't have any interviews. My first interview was, I believe, in January 20th. And then after that, I had 8 interview invites and multiple acceptances. And I interviewed all the way until April. So it does happen every single year, and I see it all the time. So hang in there. Try to focus on other things and focus on maintaining a strong application and developing your strengths if you need to. And if you find yourself in the boat where you still don't have any interviews and you're starting to receive more and more rejections, no wait lists, or you just are sure that you don't have a chance at those schools, then go ahead and contact us. Let us review your application, give you some pointers on what you would have to do if you need to reapply, and you can start planning that next course. Obviously, even if you're in that boat where you've received all those rejections, don't worry too much. Lots of people have to reapply to medical school, and that doesn't mean that you won't get in. It just means that you have another step in the process. Try to take it as it comes, be patient, be hopeful, and hopefully after the winter break, you'll get some good news going into the new year, hopefully an acceptance. And if not, hang in there and give us a call and we can try to help you through the next steps. Thanks everyone for listening. Happy holidays.
Our mission is to inspire, encourage, and inform students as you journey through a rigorous and intricate process of achieving your dreams in medicine. Visit us at prospectivedoctor.com and medschoolcoach.com for more essential resources in your medical school journey and beyond.